Vallarta in Mexico on December 25th for a 1-week stay at an all-inclusive hotel. Never been to one. It was amazing. The accommodations were great, and if you ever went hungry at one of these places, it's your own fault. So we saw some of the sights in town, but within a few days, I started feeling unwell. And so did Michelle. And as was the custom in those days, you had to take a COVID test before you could fly back to the States. So this was December 31st. So I tested positive, and the hotel was so gracious, they put us up for free in a portion of the hotel that was for people who tested positive. So the difference was that I was hoping to recover, but Michelle's illness lasted not even 3 days. And after 3 days, I'm fine, everything's okay. However, for me, I got progressively worse and worse, and finally, we called the hotel doctor, and I had a blood oximeter rating in the 80s, which is not so good. And so she recommended we go to the hospital right away. So I got to ride in an ambulance all the way down to the hospital. And it was a very interesting ride, because not all the roads are smooth and flat, and not everybody gets out of the way for the ambulance. But at any rate, we got to the hospital, they took a CT scan of my lungs, and they determined that I needed treatment. So after 3 days, I was discharged. Now, a lot of this that I'm relating to you, like how long I was in the hotel, whether I was in a coma, I didn't even know, I don't remember. Michelle would tell me later. So after 3 days, I was discharged. We left the hospital and went across the street to stay at a hotel, and there I ended up sitting for about 4 hours in the hotel lobby, waiting for our room, so I just got worse and worse. So the next morning, I had another low oximeter rating, so Michelle took me back over to the hospital. They did a CT scan and found my lungs were about 95% COVID. So I was readmitted in the COVID section of the intensive care unit, and Michelle continued to stay at the hotel near the hospital, down the street and around the corner, and she was only able to get updates about me by phone in the afternoon when the hospital would call her. That was like her only contact was through the hospital. So the hospital would tell her that I was getting progressively worse, and basically there was nothing else they could do except to put me in an induced medical coma, intubate me and ventilate me. The coma lasted for 10 days. And I had some very interesting spiritual experiences, which is one of the reasons I'm here. Because I was getting worse and less coherent than I normally am. I do remember 2 things very clearly about a couple of decisions that I had made that I wanted to share with you. First, I went into total prayer to God constantly. As I prayed to God, I completely and totally surrendered to divine will, as if I was to transition now and then let it be, or if I was to stay on this planet a while longer, I would stay in that complete surrender to God, whatever God wanted of me. Second, I really focused on maintaining and retaining my faith. That is, I ferociously trusted my intuition and my spiritual faculties. No matter what, I remained steadfast in that faith. I had several visitations by celestial beings and masters. Makes my hair stand on end just to tell you this. These were as though they were physically floating in my room near my bed, slightly above. One of my main physical, now transition teachers, Dr. Hiroshi Motoyama, promised that he would be with me and not leave me. Another master, Paramahansa Yogananda, promised, as did Dr. Motoyama, that he would stay with me the whole time, but they and the other beings, including my guides, hinted that I was not yet complete in this lifetime, which made me feel that I might survive despite having such a dire prognosis. Can you imagine staring at hospital ceilings for 2 months? There were several transrational experiences and interactions both before, during, and after my induced coma. A side note is that I didn't even know I was in a coma until Michelle explained it to me long after I was home from the hospital in April of this year. I think, in part, That is what sustained me as a few days into the induced coma, the hospital informed my wife, Michelle, that I was beginning to improve. Because basically they had given up all hope. Once you're on a ventilator, it's a good sign you're on the way out. Basically, they told Michelle, nothing we can do for him. We'll put him on a ventilator. Can you imagine what Michelle must have been feeling in Mexico, not able to visit me, which is why I'm so excited for Michelle to express her feelings of how that was, the incredible uncertainty that she was experiencing. And I later found out that doctors said I had several strikes against me, not just 3, but 4. That I was 68, I was a male, I was unvaccinated, and I was overweight. Although, as you can see, I did lose about 50 pounds, but I wouldn't recommend this method of doing it. So I got discharged on February 5th, from early January to February. Michelle was allowed to speak with me only briefly on the phone once they had decided they were going to put me in an induced coma and ventilate me, because it might be the last time she would ever speak with me. She was not allowed to visit. Another side note, as Michelle will tell you after I'm done with my presentation, is that she was my advocate. And she made sure that our insurance was covered and all, if you can imagine the details from another country, and it turned out that Kaiser covered the entire hospital stay while I was there. Talk about being blessed. And all the details that would need to be done in the background while I lay there in the hospital room from January 9th to February 5th. After I was out of the coma for 10 days, I was moved to my own hospital room. Because I was in a coma for so long, I lost all ability to walk or stand. In addition, I developed 7 pressure sores, the worst which was below my coccyx. That's just below your tailbone. The hospital then allowed Michelle to see me, but she was wearing all kinds of protective clothing from head to foot, a face mask, a bonnet. She looked like a field of blue here. And all this protective clothing, and all I could see was her eyes. So about 10 minutes into her talking to me, I looked and I said, "Are you Michelle?" She's like, what she must have thought. Because I was so out of it. I was also very incoherent and had aphasia. It was difficult to speak. I even tried to get out of bed telling Michelle, "I'm fine now, let's go home." But I thought she was there to take me home. So can you imagine how hard this must have been on my beloved Michelle? She was alone in a hotel room in Puerto Vallarta from January 9th to February 5th while I was in the hospital, and couldn't visit me until I was out of the coma and the ICU. And her only lifeline to me was a phone call every day from the hospital. So what Michelle did is she kept notes. And she would call UCM, she would call my other healers, she would keep everybody up to date. And as I'll probably tell you countless times, my heart is such gratitude to you, because I know that if it wasn't for your prayers and your healing work, I would not be here. I'm certain of it. So, can you imagine everything Michelle underwent, being alone and not knowing if I was going to die, if she was going to take me home in a little box of ashes from Mexico? But she kept doing her work as an integrative psychologist over the computer and all of the other things she needed to do, but by herself. When we flew back on a commercial airliner to San Diego from Puerto Vallarta on February 5th, we had one of the doctors accompany me on the flight. For every movement of my body on that day was a deadlift. I had no ability to walk. I could stand, but I couldn't do anything. So that means people had to physically lift me, as I had no ability to walk, including being placed on a gurney, the ambulance ride, being placed into a wheelchair, then being placed in another wheelchair, waiting for the ticket area, getting to the aircraft, being placed in a seat, and Michelle got first class seats, so it would be a little easier. But it was excruciating, because they were not allowed to give me any medicine other than ibuprofen and Advil, because the doctor couldn't give me meds because he was a Mexican doctor on a commercial flight. He wasn't allowed to give me any prescription drugs, but I sure wanted them. So when we arrived in San Diego on February 5th, Saturday, Michelle called 911 to get an ambulance. They took me to the Kaiser ER. I was admitted, and in between stays at that hospital and an advanced care nursing facility, I did not improve because I still was post-COVID, but these pressure sores were still doing their thing. And finally, they readmitted me to Kaiser and performed surgery on my pressure sore on the day of my birthday, March 1st. I was discharged to go home from the hospital on March 4th. We had a fancy hospital airbed placed in our home, and I had to wear something called a wound vacuum. Because the pressure sore at the base of my spine was so large, there was also a very big risk of infection. In fact, when I had surgery in March 1st, the doctors were worried that the wound at the base of my spine was so deep, over 3 inches, that it had reached the bone, when they were happy to find out it didn't, because if it reached the bone, that would be like, you're done. It was a really difficult at home, as Michelle was in our bed, in the bedroom, but I was in the hospital bed in the living room, and I could only sleep on my side. I could not sleep on my back because that would aggravate the wound. So it was very interesting for a long time. Thank God for all of the help and support. Our home looked like a hospital supply business because I had the hospital bed, the wound vac, a large wheelchair, a large walker, 5 oxygen tanks, and a very noisy oxygen maker that reminded me of my dad's machine shop all the time when I'm wearing this device that keeps the oxygen going, because it was constantly on all the time, not to mention the wound vacuum supplies, and you had to change it like every other day because it had a removable canister that would fill up, and you throw the canister away, you put one on. So March 4th, Friday night, I'm back from the hospital, and I have the wound vac, and then at 1:30 in the morning, Saturday morning, beep, beep. And I'm thinking, what is that? Well, the canister was full. We didn't know what to do. We didn't know how to change it. We thought you had to drain it. Remember that? So we got it figured out. But I had visits from physical therapy, home health care nurses, wound care nurses 3 times a week to change my dressing, sponge baths, and so forth. And finally, was able to be done with the wound vac in a hospital bed sometime in June. 6 months of the year in some kind of hospital bed. I was finally able to walk with a cane in April, so for the first 2 months of this year, I was in hospitals and in a hospital bed for 6 months. I had to wear the wound vacuum until June. There were several other types of artifacts that COVID that seriously affected me, including cognitive problems, and I still have problems with stamina and walking. What were my transformative experiences after all of this? Awakening to a transtemporal and transspatial state beyond my mind's abilities to comprehend them. What was that like? I can tell you, it was incredibly transformative and positive, but not all rainbows and unicorns. Not everything was. Or anything much like what you might see in the movies. Usually with me, my guides make me work. They put me to work. And I clearly remember, just as I'm standing in front of you right now, that some of the unfolding events that I was a part of in the astral dimension before, during the coma, and afterwards were so live and so real, just as real as I'm standing here. Because of all the downloads I received, I'm still getting bits and flashes from my guides, protectors, masters, celestial beings. There was also a part of it where I had to go and work in the astral dimension. And there were several different scenarios that unfolded that I very clearly remember. In one scenario, I was walking into villages where the heads of the drug cartels lived. I remember walking through these villages among the many armed people and going to the hacienda on top of a little hill to meet with the leader of this cartel and his guards standing around him with pistols and rifles and machetes. I could clearly see the colorful buildings, the streets with running fountains, people talking, even remember driving an old car through the village with the dust coming up, and I could smell the foliage around me. When I approached this leader, I could make out every detail of the stature, his face, his bald head, his mustache, and the steely look in his eyes. Looking around, his hacienda was very beautiful, but he was surrounded by all kinds of armed men. I knew at any moment he could nod his head and someone would kill me on the spot. But I knew I was there to speak to him and to ask him to cease his violence and drugs, that there was a better way. And I met him eye to eye with nothing. And I suppose that because I met with him eye to eye, maybe that's why he didn't kill me, or at least attempt to kill the astral version of myself. As I said, the scenario of that village looked like the cars, the people, everything I could sense with my five senses. I was interacting also with the 12-year-old son of this cartel leader, this boss. The son said, "You sleep in too soft of a bed." And I thought, what does he mean by that? What he meant was, you don't have a hard life like I have growing up in this environment. You don't know anything. This was his way of telling me that his life experience was a very hard one, but I didn't have one. But I began to work with this 12-year-old boy, and face to face, and to help him soften his heart and awaken his spiritual self. But his friends that were his age did not like me at all, because they didn't want him to change. They were trying to kill me running through the streets, but he stopped them. Somehow his mother, the wife of the cartel boss, misinterpreted what I was trying to do, and she wanted me killed in a very gruesome way, which I will not share with you, but I do remember everything clearly, every detail leading up to what she wanted to do. Now, this is probably one of the most colorful events that I encountered, which was not sparkly and light and celestial choirs, but it was something I'm supposed to do. Because our spirit works in ways that our conscious mind doesn't necessarily always comprehend. We don't always know what's going on here in the astral version of ourselves, or the causal version, or the Purusha version of ourselves. So, when I encountered in the spiritual realms, I was continuously surrendering to God's will and ferociously maintaining my faith. I know this is not the rainbows and unicorns, but I also knew that my message to me, that the foundation of everything I do is based in love. And this experience has helped me to rededicate my life in service to others. As I said in the beginning, I am a completely different person. When I came home from the hospital on March 4th, I had aphasia. I would be talking to people like this. It was the best I could do. I couldn't speak clearly. If I wanted to get around, I had to use a wheelchair or a walker. I had no stamina. I had lots of trouble putting my thoughts together. And Michelle, my dear Michelle, she would put it this way: when you came home from the hospital, you were like a talking vegetable. More than usual. So the inner transformation from during my illness of COVID, the induced coma, and spiritual encounters with the celestial beings and masters gave me a much bigger and broader picture, still unfolding. And my understanding of the unfolding of the events that are occurring right now on our planet. It really is a time for inner transformation for all of us. But I've been saying for years that this is the golden era of inner transformation. But I had no idea in December of last year that I would go through such an inner transformation where I come out of it, and I'm still coming out of it as a different person. Some would say, oh, your energy has shifted. You feel different. I spent tremendous amount of time out of my body, traveling in the astral and causal dimensions of the universe, encountering many But a kind of an expansiveness is difficult for me to convey to you. Maybe you sense it on another level. Think what it would be like to attend an advanced university for years and then spend months unpacking everything you've learned. Some beings I recognize from the Pleiades, and some I recognize from other star systems. But other beings were entirely new to me that I had met. They seem to mutually agree that this really is a transformative time for global and planetary healing on a scale that hasn't been seen for 25,000 years. Some of the vistas I encountered were like the ones that you would think of looking at heaven, where from horizon to horizon was nothing but gold and white light, with countless beings in a form of loving harmony that was all-encompassing, saturated my senses with its immenseness. I was called to do even more work in the physical dimension, if you can believe that, but at a managed pace for my physical vessel. That is, I now have to be really careful in the management of my physical energy because of my age and the after effects of COVID, which are still ongoing. Spirit wants me to do even more. And when I heard from Mary, the conference chair, that she wanted me to be the keynote speaker, I started thinking about, once again, how Spirit works in the background and pulls the strings of the cosmic purse together so that we can all benefit from our lived spiritual experiences. And I can't emphasize that enough. There's so much that has happened because of this experience. And while I'm in that experience in January and February, Spirit's doing this stuff in the background that sets up, oh, you know, you're going to have a wellness center. You don't know it yet, but you will. Or Mary's going to be conference chair. She's going to ask you to come and speak, but you don't know that yet. And I can tell you some other things that are going on that I'm not at liberty yet to divulge, but they're just like that. These things that are unfolding that this conscious mind is not aware of, but that my spirit is already putting this together in space-time for it to unfold. So, to be frank with you, my own intuitive abilities have been magnified exponentially. But I still wrestle with having enough stamina and sleep. The healing powers that flow through me are now even more powerful than they already were, as I feel my vessel has been prepared for even greater work. I feel I can be completely honest with you. Not ego, but honest. As you may have heard me say before, Spirit is always working in the background. We don't always know what the machinations are, but we do know that there is a constant spiritual presence that is creating the situations and circumstances that we encounter in life that determines how we choose to develop the nature of our character in a given lifetime. So it's not so much the goals, it's more about the effort that develops our character in a lifetime. It's more about the decisions of your actions that define you. I realize that when I'm in fear, I feel very alone. But when I surrender to God, that I am fully embraced in His arms, and I'm never alone. There were even times when masters and God and other celestial beings would embrace and hold me in the hospital bed. Like I felt held while I was in the ICU, and they would constantly reassure me. As Spirit works in the background, fast forwarding to July of this year, it had been Michelle's dream to have a wellness center, and for me to have a brick and mortar home for my energy medicine school, so that she and I could provide even more service to humanity. And interestingly enough, just such a wellness center came up for lease, and we opened the Bamboo Garden Wellness Center in Encinitas, which is northern San Diego. which now represents that brick and mortar home for my integrative chocolate therapy teachings, my own workshops, my spiritual counseling sessions, and so forth, as it does for Michelle. And we have 7 treatment rooms. We already have naturopaths and massage therapists and acupuncturists already renting out these rooms, so it's starting to flourish already. But uncertainty is something you and I have been thrown into in the past couple of years. I can remember the 1990s saying to people, it's going to get more intense before it gets better. And people were saying, well, you're talking about 2012. Well, here we are 10 years after 2012, and it's still intense. So especially in these uncertain times where there is so much going on, whether there's a pandemic, a financial crisis, or a shortage of chips, whether they're Doritos or integrated circuits, or food, or climbing prices, and so forth. I suppose that the reason I'm still here is because God's not done with me yet. And perhaps I stand before you today when otherwise I certainly would have made my transition, because I also know that I would not be here today if it wasn't for your prayers and healing work. As I said earlier, I'm certain, no question. Okay, what type of spiritual tools can we employ in spiritual times? But I didn't want to just talk about my lived experience without giving you, because I'm more of a how-to than a gee whiz type person. I'm more like, here's some things you can do to empower yourself. I think one of the key things to remember can be summed up in a quote from Paramhansa Yogananda. One cannot be any closer to God than you already are, but you can reveal that closeness. That's a way of saying that we already live in oneness. There's nothing to find because nothing's lost. There's nowhere to go because you're already there. So let us start knowing that our spiritual center is already in place. We only reveal something that we already possess, which is also why, as ministers, we do the spiritual work in our service to the global human community. Make no mistake, what you do here affects all creation. That is our foundation. Love is our foundation, and the lens through which we see is faith. Faith is the bridge that merges the physical, astral, and causal dimensions as one. Imagine that faith as ministers is the bridge that becomes so strong that one cannot tell the difference between the physical and the astral dimension because it has merged together, as our faith has merged them as one. Without faith, it's almost impossible to grow spiritually. You cannot get there with 5 sense perception intellect. It won't work. Your reach has to extend beyond your grasp. And as we are all ministers in one form or another, our work is to be an example of faith for those who seek and for those who suffer. The more clearly and intently we focus our spiritual being on merging our own physical and astral nature, the more we create an intersection where we represent that level of awakeness through the emanation of our being, that 95% of you and I that's not verbal or physical, but is the radiatory quality of our spirit. That level of awakeness or awareness goes everywhere and can be felt by all of the constellation of your relationships. Everything, everywhere. To quote Paramhansa Yogananda once again, the deeper the self-realization of a man, the more he influences the whole by his subtle spiritual vibrations. We must realize as ministers who are consistently and continually awakening ourselves spiritually, that as we awaken our chakras and evolve, we also represent those levels of evolution on a subtle energy level to the entirety of the universe. Not just to give the 5 kingdoms, not just to the 5 kingdoms here on earth, the mineral, plant, the animal, the deva, which are nature spirits and so forth, and human, but all creation. Therefore, the people that are drawn to you in your ministry will take a psychic relationship to the level that you have achieved in your awareness as ministers. It is the way you provide a level for them to aspire to, because now you hold that place. So you evolve to a certain level of being. Now you represent that level. People sense it intuitively, and that's why they're drawn to you. And you recognize this as souls come to you who want to see the way, but it's more important that you understand your faculties are working 24/7. And if you achieve a level of awareness, and you know that's why that person came into your life, you can better facilitate their sacred journey. But because you hold that level, they can aspire to that level and beyond. It's so important for you to know. What I have learned is not to expect that I understand it all. But then understanding is not necessary for cooperation. And that is where the strength of my faith comes in. Because I don't always have to figure it out in this mind. And that's where I must trust. I wish I could explain more about the depth of my experiences, but perhaps that will come in time as it keeps unpacking and unfolding. First, one of the most powerful and central tools you can use in times of uncertainty is remaining stable in your spiritual practices. That includes embracing the way your faculties, your spiritual faculties, your intuition works for you, because not everybody's visual. And I've heard many students say, well, I don't see that. Okay, well, maybe you feel it. Maybe you know it. Maybe you hear it. But all intuitive faculties go to the same place. So embrace the way your faculties work for you, because that's your authenticity. That's your authentic self. And it all leads to the same place. And it's not whether you have power, it's that you have power. So it's never whether I have to go get power. It is surrendering to the power you already possess. And you allow it to come forth. You don't push. The feminine principle is using the power of the will to yield instead of push. You allow your spiritual power to come forth. You give it permission to come forth. You allow yourself to be powerful. Not ever whether you're powerful. Second, surrender to God. That's the word I like to use. You know, there's lots of words we use. Mother, Father, God, Divine Creator, Creative Source, all that is. But the surrender doesn't mean I give in, I give up. It means I am. I am that. Not trusting in some God over here, but this one, within us. And you do it with all your heart and all your being to surrender the divine will within you. Third, maintain the intensity of your faith. Faith is trusting with your heart, what your mind doesn't yet know. Not yet. That's the hard part. You want to figure it out before you do it. It doesn't work that way. Faith is the leap, the trust, the inner vision, the inner knowing. Faith is knowing something to be true when there's no physical evidence to support it yet. Without faith, as I said, it is almost impossible to grow spiritually, because you cannot imagine that a level of awareness is based on intellect. Awareness is not conceptual thinking or imagination. It's a state of being that you achieve through your prayers, meditations, your spiritual work, your trust, your faith, your surrender to God. When you faithfully use these three tools to navigate these uncertain times, not only do you become a much more stable platform for real spiritual growth, but you also then represent that level to all those who seek and those who suffer. And that they may clearly self-empower and self-realize, because you facilitated the awakening of their inner journey upon their sacred